Hello and welcome to Property Question Time. My name's Stephen Galpin and this is the programme where you can have your property related questions answered by our team of property experts. Joining me today are Byron Crellin, MD of Debt Squared Group Limited. Welcome, Byron.
Hi, Stephen.
And joining us via Zoom from France, Joanna Leggett, co-founder of Leggett Immobilier.
Hi, Stephen. It's great to be here again. Thank you for having me.
Byron, I think we'll go straight on with your first question, which is, although there have been various restraining measures put in place by the government to protect the eviction of commercial tenants from their place of business, it appears an alternative method of effecting an eviction is being used with the High Court. The process seems to be that the landlord will seek judgment in the High Court and then use the High Court's powers of enforcement to seek possession of the property. Is this a legitimate process and could it affect the residential tenants and borrowers too?
I think one of our viewers has been surfing the internet and has found various articles.
I think you're probably right.
And read one and linked it to another. Government introduced legislation as a result of the beginning of the pandemic to protect tenants. So let's break it down at a very high level. In Scotland, to evict a tenant, a commercial tenant, it's called a irritation of lease.
Right.
And you have to engage with a solicitor and we can assist with all the kind of processes, etc., with different legislation. In England and Wales, there's legislation in place at this moment in time and it's to be reviewed. The government are going to either update beforehand or on the 30th of June. But at the moment there is a protection to prevent any tenant from a commercial property being evicted, or what we call a forfeiture of lease, termination of lease, for non-payment of rent. So they're protected under the COVID legislation that came through by the government. There is the provision to evict a tenant from a commercial property if there's a breach of lease, and I think we've talked about it on previous shows that that there is that measure within a lease that if a tenant breaches the covenants in terms of what they're allowed to do in terms of an operational aspect. If they breach that and don't correct it, then there is that facility for a landlord to take that action through an enforcement agent. In terms of the High Court, the use of the High Court would be typically a writ of possession. So again, let's stay with a commercial property. If a commercial property is vacant and a individual or individuals illegally enter the property, they're deemed to be squatting. And if they claim to have squatters' rights, then the legal process is you would engage with a company like Debt Squared. You'd also work with a firm of solicitors. Other enforcement agents are available, Stephen. You also work with other law firms, and that law firm would then make an application through the court process, and a writ of possession would then be issued from the High Court to ourselves, and then the whole process is enforced. Residential is different. So residential, in Scotland, you've got to give notice. I think it's 6 months' notice. In Wales, it is at the end of May when the Welsh Government are due to give an update in terms of protecting residential tenants. And in terms of commercial tenants in England, again, 30th of June is the trigger date. It's a minefield, and I sympathise with the viewer, but there are companies out there that can provide advice and guidance through it.
It's not terribly clear, is it? But I suppose some landlords will use every means to their bow for getting people out of a property that they want to repossess. I suppose it's just a natural process, isn't it?
I think actually, pre-COVID, there was this take matters into my own hands sort of attitude by certain landlords, maybe on residential and commercial portfolios. We would never endorse that. The law is the law, and it's there to protect both sides. I think what's happened as a result of COVID, and there's very limited benefits as a result of what COVID brought on us, but there is this now legislation that is quite clear, and I appreciate there's a lot of information out there and to keep up to date with it, etc. But tenants are protected, landlords arguably not, because they can't collect rent and they've got tenants there that are not paying rent. I think the general consensus is that landlords and tenants as a result of COVID have actually engaged more than possibly beforehand, because there is a requirement to talk and to discuss you know, the trading difficulties, longevity of the relationship. Can I stay in the property? Can I trade, etc.?
It's not all bad news then.
Not all bad.
There we go. All right. We're now going to go over to Joanna in France. Joanna, your first question is, do the French property experts on the panel think that a move to France for UK residents wishing to relocate to France for either retirement or simply a lifestyle change has actually proved easier or more difficult post-Brexit? If indeed COVID has slowed things down and affected anticipated changes, what would one look out for?
Well, I would say it's going to be slightly harder to move since Brexit, whereas before, you know, we were quite free to move wherever we wanted to go in Europe as British people. However, it's still it's not a difficult process. You do have to get a residency card, so you have to go to the prefecture and apply for that. And they will ask you to prove means now, which they never did in the past. So if you're retired, you'd need to prove how much your income is. And I think it's between 500 to 1200 per family you need to be earning a month. So whether that's through pension savings or you are still working or working in France, you'd need to show that as an income so that you're not reliant on the state as such. But other than that, it's really quite straightforward. The buying process hasn't changed. And us as estate agents have been selling houses to Americans, South Africans and other non-European clients for many years. So it's a little bit different, but it's not that much different. And there's certainly no financial change since we've left Brexit.
Thank you, Joanna. Joanna, what areas would you recommend as a good place to look for someone retiring to France?
Well, if you're coming to retire, there's no changes in any costs unless you bought a holiday home and then there was capital gains tax. But if you're coming to live in your permanent home, then there's absolutely no change. There's no difference in costs whatsoever. The cost of living, I would say, is probably slightly higher in France. The supermarket costs, I find more expensive than they are in the UK. However, France is a completely different way of life. It's a lifestyle choice. A lot of people grow their own vegetables and things like that, for example. You've got much more space, much more time. Some things, for example, wine is a lot cheaper, but there are certain things that are more expensive. So I would say that the cost of living is slightly higher than it would be in the UK, but then it depends how you live. If you've come to retire, then you probably wouldn't spend as much as you perhaps would, if you were living or working in the UK. So supermarkets and things are slightly higher, but everything else, the taxes are the same. There's not very much difference. In fact, the taxes are probably slightly cheaper. If you're buying in the countryside, insurances are quite cheap because there's very little crime. So car insurance and house insurances could be a lot cheaper than they are in the UK. If you're buying in cities, they're probably going to be the same because, as in cities, there is always, unfortunately, some crime. But local rural areas where a lot of Brits do buy, for example, in the Dordogne, in the Charente, those type of areas, it is quite cheap. So certain things will be cheaper, but perhaps supermarkets might be more expensive.
Okay, that's all we've got time for in this half of the show. Join me again after the break. Hello and welcome back to part 2 of Property Question Time. Joining me is Byron Crellin from Debt Squared. Byron, welcome back. And your second question is, I have a commercial property which, due to a tenancy void, will be vacant for around 3 months until the new tenant I found takes over. I wonder what legitimate protective steps I can take to ensure that the property is not subject to unwanted or unwelcome occupants during this time. I know there are strict regulations about CCTV, etc., and wonder what other restrictions I might have to conform to whilst protecting the property.
Okay, it's refreshing that.
I take it the days of an Alsatian and a baseball bat are over, are they?
Absolutely, Stephen. Absolutely. I've been in the industry for 30 years, and I've never seen that.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, it's refreshing that a landlord is aware of risk in terms of a property being vacant. We manage on behalf of clients multiple void properties. I think the key thing really, and again, this is something the landlord can do directly, or if they have an agent, or through a solicitor, or an organisation such as ourselves, the lease will have an insurance requirement, and the insurance requirement will stipulate certain dynamics in terms of what that property will require. Typically, you could have a key box, you could have an alarm, but key would be having weekly inspections carried out. So this would be, you know, ourselves or an agent on behalf of the landlord carrying an insurance inspection at the property, entering the property, doing the meter readings, etc., making sure that the property is tight and secure, etc. In terms of the fabric of how you secure a property, from a corner shop to a, you know, a several thousand square foot warehouse, different dynamics in terms of different requirements. So each property requirement is different. The key thing is that secure the property. One very quick case study, a client that had the option to secure a property with an alarm, chose not to because he had a tenant coming in, I think it was circa 2 to 3 weeks later, didn't. 2 individuals broke into the property, £60,000 worth of damage later.
Mm-hmm. False economies.
Indeed.
Byron, looking at the internet, and I was just sort of researching this question, there are various sort of automated solutions, aren't there, for the sort of yards and more industrial type premises, I suppose, that you can activate surveillance.
Yeah, no, absolutely. One of the, I probably suppose, in terms of parameters of where you've got lock-up units, etc., or you've got big estates, CCTV towers are used on a regular basis. We push out towers across the UK for clients, and technology now is that we're able to have a 24/7 watch on a property. We're able to react if we see something. Technology has moved so fast now. You've got heat detection. You'll be able to identify a false alarm. You're able to see where risk is. You're able to change dynamics because of weather. So there's a real broad opportunity now in terms of security services that are available for a landlord on a vacant property. Certainly CCTV is, from an insurance point of view, key.
Okay, I've even seen some sort of robot type things like they're using on Mars at the moment, sort of wandering around in people's sort of commercial yard areas.
Yep. It's more bespoke for certain clients. I don't think we're quite yet at drones, but certainly the old-fashioned turn up and check the property, key holding service that that is operated. But CCTV is traditionally where it is.
Well, I see one of the courier companies is dropping off posts now to the Channel Islands with a drone. So I suppose you could drone keys into people and all sorts of things, couldn't you?
That's the future, Stephen.
Watch
the future.
Space. Okay, all right, Byron. Thank you for that. Right, over to Joanna Leggett in France now. I'm considering moving to France for my retirement and wonder what the experts' view of the costs of living in France are compared with the UK. And are there any significant changes up or down in the costs that would be obviously noticeable since we left the EU? Joanna?
Well, if you're retiring, first of all, I would find a city that you like and draw a half an hour circle around it. Definitely do your research before buying, because there'll be certain things as we get older that we'll need. So you might need hospitals or you might need doctors, etc., etc. So you don't want to be too isolated or too far away from those type of things. So every city will have a hospital that you may need to go to at some stage. So I would try and sort of make sure that you're within half an hour or 40 minutes from a city that would have one. And then I would also say, don't be too isolated, because that France is huge and a lot of the locations are really, really rural. I would say always be in a village or edge of a village so that you can walk in, because you want to be able to integrate into the local community, and you want to be able to meet people, etc., and have a chat in the boulangerie and things like that. So, and it is a much, much slower pace of life in the countryside in France. People will chat for 20 minutes when you're in a queue, and it's like, oh, hurry up, but it's quite fun. But it's, so I would say there's everywhere in France has beautiful villages. So it really depends on your travelling backwards and forwards to the UK. Do you need to be near airports? Don't be too far from a city. Make sure that you can get in and out of a city. Temperatures change depending on where you are. If you don't like extreme heat, then you might want to move into the middle of France, like the Centre regions or the Limousin or Burgundy, for example. If you want the heat, you might want the south of France or the southwest of France, or even southern Brittany has a microclimate that's lovely and warm. And then it depends if you've got grandchildren, etc., and you're needing to go back to the UK to see grandchildren or for the family to visit, then don't be too far away from, say, airports or train stations, etc. for that. If you're coming with pets, or if pets are coming backwards and forwards, that you're going to have to drive. So, make sure that it's not too long a drive coming backwards and forwards from the UK. But that's probably would be the best advice. The main thing is really to do your research and try to spend some time in the area. So when you're coming to look for a property, try and spend at least 3 or 4 days when you find an area that you like, really going in, chatting to the people in the restaurants when they're open, of course, and cafes, etc., and see what facilities there are in the particular village.
Thank you, Joanna. That's very good. Joanna, are people free now to travel around France to look at various properties? Is it restricted at all, or have things been relaxed in that area?
At the moment, obviously, there is a travel ban on. You are allowed to travel at the moment if you're coming to buy a permanent home. You're not allowed to travel if you're coming to buy a holiday home. So those are the sort of rules and regulations. So if you are looking to move and become a resident, then yes, you are allowed to come and you are allowed to do viewings. Obviously, we have to put all the precautions in place as an agency. So we're constantly, making sure that the vendors aren't at the property, that all the doors are open, all of that type of thing. We can only have 2 people on a viewing. Masks are worn, hand gels provided, don't travel in the same car, all of those types of things. So it's the general COVID regulations that we follow, but we are still seeing there's a lot of Brits in France at the moment that wanted to get in before Brexit, so they're renting and they're looking for properties, and that's another option. If you want to move to France and you've sold your house in the UK, you can move over and rent whilst looking. That is also allowed with the COVID restrictions. So there's lots of possibilities. I imagine that once the travel restrictions are lifted, we're going to have the pent-up demand that we had after the first lockdown, where everybody came at once and we were really, really extremely busy, and I can see that happening again, looking at the inquiry levels that are coming through at the moment.
Okay, Joanna, thank you very much indeed for that. All right, well, that's all we've got time for in today's show. So a big thank you to Byron Crellin, MD of Debt Squared Group. Thank you so much for coming down.
Thank you, Stephen.
Hope you had a good trip down.
Indeed.
And thank you to Joanna for zooming in to us. Thank you very much for your answers, Joanna, and we look forward to seeing you again shortly. So that's all from me, Stephen Galpin. Join me again next time on Property Question Time.